They didn't even have the courage to say it to my face. Just an email at 4:47 p.m., sent while I was still on the warehouse floor keeping their system alive. After everything I designed, everything I fixed, everything I saved, they cut me loose like I was the problem. The humiliation stung deeper than I expected, especially knowing the very executives smiling upstairs were standing on work they claimed as their own. But they forgot one thing, something small, quiet, and powerful they never bothered to understand. If stories like this hit home, subscribe and tell me your experience in the comments. When people talk about warehouses, they picture dusty shelves, fluorescent lights, and workers pushing carts down long aisles. What I walked into at Skybridge Logistics 3 years ago was worse. An aging, chaotic maze where shipments piled up faster than anyone could move them. Pallets sat abandoned in corners like forgotten children. Forklifts beeped constantly because no one could see more than 5 feet ahead. Workers were exhausted, frustrated, and blamed for mistakes caused by the broken system around them. And me? I was hired to fix bottlenecks, which was the corporate way of saying perform miracles. I took one long look at that warehouse and knew they didn't need miracles. They needed a complete rebirth. The Phoenix desert sun had already toasted the building to 100 degrees inside by midday, the cooling system barely clinging to life. Trucks lined up outside waiting to unload, engines idling, drivers cursing under their breath because delays were so predictable, they planned their schedules around them. Skybridge was bleeding money in insurance claims, labor overtime, missed delivery windows, and customer complaints. Mason Clark, the CTO, kept telling the board the problems were temporary setbacks. I knew better. These were structural failures, rooted deep in the bones of the operation. And yet, I felt something spark in me. I've always been drawn to broken things, not because I enjoy fixing them, but because I see the potential buried underneath. I spent my first weeks walking the floor at dawn, clipboard in hand, watching the morning rush unfold. Workers like Miguel and Tara would give me tired smiles as they maneuvered pallets around blind corners. They'd been here for decades, and despite all the chaos, they still cared. Their stories fueled me. They deserved better than what Skybridge gave them. I mapped every movement, tracked every delay, studied every choke point. I watched conveyor belts seize up under uneven load distribution, scanners glitch out when humidity rose even a few degrees, and trucks rerouted 3 times before finding the correct bay. The warehouse's nervous system was misfiring non-stop, but underneath all that noise, I could see what it could become. I started redesigning the flow from scratch, traffic patterns, scanning sequences, load balancing, zone assignments. I rebuilt the routing structure so even a rookie could jump in without sinking the operation. But my real breakthrough came when I realized that every system in the building was speaking a different language. Nothing was integrated. Nothing communicated. Everything relied on human intervention to keep it alive. They didn't need another patch. They needed a single heartbeat guiding the entire operation. That was the moment I envisioned the core hardware module I later built through my own company, a streamlined processing unit designed not to think for the warehouse, but to coordinate it with perfect timing. I installed sensors that tracked movement down to fractions of a second, redesigned pallet flow to eliminate blind corners, and implemented routing so efficient trucks turned over in a third of the time. Within 6 months, Skybridge went from a liability to one of the Southwest's fastest turnaround hubs. Mason strutted through the floor like he'd been the mastermind behind it. Executives brought investors to tour our innovation, and the workers? For the first time in years, they weren't drowning. Overtime dropped, injury rates plummeted, productivity skyrocketed, and me? I kept my head down, working, improving, refining, making sure every piece operated flawlessly. I didn't complain when Mason erased my name from presentations. I didn't argue when Leo, the CFO, hinted that consultants like me should feel grateful for any visibility at all. I swallowed it. All of it, because deep down, I believed good work would eventually speak for itself. What I didn't realize then was that some people will bulldoze right over you to take credit for the foundation you poured with your own hands. But I also didn't realize something else. While they were busy celebrating themselves, I was building something they could never control. When Skybridge hired me, they didn't just need a systems overhaul, they needed a lifeline. The board was panicking quietly behind closed doors, praying no one would notice how close they were to losing their biggest regional clients. What they didn't understand was that failing logistics isn't a sudden collapse, it's a slow bleed. Every missed delivery, every jammed conveyor, every frustrated customer chips away at a company until one day there's nothing left to rescue. I saw that truth the moment I walked into their headquarters for the first strategy meeting. Mason sat at the head of the table, suit pressed, confidence overflowing, selling the illusion that he had everything under control. But the data on the screens behind him told a different story. Mountains of delays, weeks of backlog, complaints climbing like a staircase to nowhere. Leo, the CFO, kept rubbing his forehead like he was trying to push the numbers back into something less embarrassing. They needed answers, but none of them were ready to admit how deep the problem went. When they turned to me, I didn't sugarcoat anything. I walked them through the structural flaws, outdated routing logic, misaligned workflows, and a shockingly fragile system held together by habit and luck. The room went silent. I could feel their discomfort pressing against me, but it didn't matter. You don't fix a crisis by pretending it's not there. What I proposed wasn't a bandage, it was a rebuild. A complete redesign of the warehouse's flow, infrastructure, and timing. The board grilled me, skeptical of every suggestion. Mason acted supportive, but I could already see calculations behind his eyes, like he was tallying how much credit he could siphon off the moment things improved. Even so, they approved the plan, reluctantly. I spent the next 9 months buried inside that warehouse. Dawn to midnight, covered in dust and sweat, listening to workers tell me where things truly broke down. Management never asked them. I made them my frontline advisors. They taught me the real pain points, where shipments piled up, where equipment died at the worst moments, where outdated policies forced people into impossible positions. With that insight, I restructured the entire workflow, taking what was once a chaotic maze and shaping it into a smooth, predictable rhythm. I added new scanning checkpoints, simplified the loading sequence, and introduced real-time visibility boards that workers actually understood. The more I implemented, the more the place transformed. The floor started moving like a living organism, each part aware of the other, each shift balanced so no one carried a disproportionate load. Efficiency climbed so sharply, the board began using my weekly reports as ammunition to negotiate better contract terms with partners. They didn't say thank you, not once. To them, this was Skybridge's system, Skybridge's innovation, Skybridge's comeback. I should have seen the warning signs when Mason started referring to the project as his strategic blueprint, or when Leo started hinting that they might reevaluate consultant contributions once the system went live. But I was too buried in the work to care. I was chasing perfection, tuning workflows, tightening timing windows, eliminating friction anywhere it lingered. The warehouse began running with a smoothness that made even long-time workers stop and stare. One of the team leaders told me, half joking, "If they don't give you the keys to this place, they're out of their minds." I laughed at the time. I didn't realize the truth behind his joke. Skybridge valued results, but not the people who delivered them. I thought building something remarkable would finally earn me my place. Instead, I was unknowingly setting the stage for the moment. They would decide they no longer needed me at all. The day it happened wasn't dramatic at first. It was one of those long, dusty Phoenix afternoons where the heat settles on your skin like a second shirt, and the warehouse hums with the steady rhythm of a system I had spent years reshaping. I was standing near Dock 12 reviewing throughput numbers on my tablet, making sure the late afternoon surge wouldn't choke the loading lanes. Everything was flowing exactly how it should. Clean, smooth, efficient. Then came the sound. A sharp email ping that sliced through the noise like a blade. I glanced down automatically, expecting a routine update. Instead, I saw the subject line: "Immediate action required, personnel transition." I didn't need to open it to know. My stomach tightened the way it does when a storm rolls in before you even see the clouds. I tapped the screen anyway. Dear Catalina, following our recent completion of the Skybridge Operations Revitalization Initiative, we have reassessed our organizational needs moving forward. Your role as lead systems architect will conclude effective Friday, November 18th. Please coordinate with HR regarding transition procedures. Sincerely, Mason Clark, Chief Technology Officer. That was it. After everything I built, after every night I stayed past midnight tuning variables and redesigning flows, after the sweat, the bruised shins from climbing metal racks, the endless troubleshooting sessions, I got 4 sentences, not even a phone call. 4 cold sentences delivered at 4:47 p.m. while I was still on the floor ensuring their system didn't crack under pressure. I felt the humiliation hit first, hot and sharp, pulsing at the back of my throat. A few workers saw me freeze, and one of them asked if everything was okay. I forced a nod because I wasn't about to let Skybridge steal my dignity in front of the very people who kept the place alive. Without a word, I walked toward the mezzanine where the glass-walled executive offices overlooked the floor like a fortress above the people doing the real work. Mason was in one of those offices at that very moment. I could see him through the glass, laughing with a group of visiting board members as he clicked through a slideshow. My slideshow, the color-coded operational maps I created, the timing models I designed, the flow diagrams I'd sketched by hand when the software crashed, and there at the bottom of the screen was the title, Strategic Systems Architecture, presented by CTO Mason Clark. My name wasn't anywhere, not a footnote, not a mention, nothing. As he spoke, he gestured confidently, as if the successes he described had been birthed by his own hands, as if he'd ever once stood sweating on the floor trying to untangle a pallet jam at 2 a.m. Watching him was a punch to the chest. The betrayal wasn't subtle, it was intentional. It had been planned. I realized then that the email wasn't a sudden decision. It was the final step in a process that started months ago, when Mason stopped looping me into meetings. When Leo started quietly reallocating budget lines I used to control, when my access to certain dashboards mysteriously expired, they weren't eliminating a role, they were eliminating me. The humiliation settled into something colder, heavier, not rage exactly, but clarity. They thought they were done with me. They thought they were finally free to claim my work as their own. What none of them realized in that moment, not Mason, not the board, not anyone watching from behind those glass walls, was that the system they were celebrating wasn't fully theirs, not the most important part. And in less than a month, they would learn just how big a mistake they had made. 2 days after the email, I was still technically employed, which meant they expected me to show up, smile politely, and pretend nothing had happened. HR told me they needed a smooth transition, which was corporate language for don't cause a scene while we milk your knowledge dry. I walked into headquarters knowing exactly what the day held. Another presentation, another performance of Mason basking in applause built on the bones of my work. What I didn't expect was how blatant it would be. They ushered me into the executive conference room, a long glass box suspended over the warehouse floor, like a viewing platform at a zoo. Investors from Denver Freight Partners were visiting, potentially Skybridge's largest incoming contract of the year. Everyone was dressed sharp, polished, rehearsed. Even Leo had ironed his shirt, which never happened unless big money was involved. I took a seat at the far corner of the table, deliberately out of the spotlight. If they were going to treat me as invisible, I would play the part. The lights dimmed, and Mason stepped forward with a confidence that bordered on theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, today you'll see the culmination of Skybridge's most ambitious operational overhaul to date, he said, clicking to the first slide. My slide, the warehouse blueprint I created, the exact color-coded flow lanes I designed to fix their bottlenecks, but the title at the top punched me harder than the email had. Skybridge Phoenix Revitalization, Lead Architect CTO Mason Clark. Lead Architect. He didn't even bother to soften the lie. The investors leaned forward, impressed. He walked them through the processes I had spent months developing, down to the minute details of truck sequencing, conveyor synchronization, and staffing distribution. Every line, every chart, every efficiency curve, mine. It felt like watching someone steal my voice and use it to narrate their own success story. When they reached the Q&A portion, one of the Denver reps, A sharp woman with a military posture asked, "How did you determine the recalibration interval for the south loading zone? That seems unusually precise." I waited. Mason hesitated. A tiny flicker, barely visible. He didn't know. He never cared enough to learn the deeper mechanics. Leo jumped in before Mason slipped. "Our operations team handled the technical specifics," he said smoothly. Mason provided the overarching design. That was the moment I realized they had rehearsed a way to avoid mentioning me entirely. My signature was on every calibration, every timing model, every decision tree. But here, in this polished room where reputation was currency, they had scrubbed me out like I'd never existed. The humiliation thickened, but something else formed underneath it. A quiet, steady resolve. The more I watched them parade my work around like a trophy, the more I understood what was coming. When the investors asked to see the live system on the floor, Mason practically glowed. He thought the warehouse was his triumph. He thought he could stand before the world and wear the crown I forged for him. But he didn't understand the foundation well enough to know what held that crown in place. And he had no idea that the most important part of the system, the part that kept everything running in sync, belonged to me and me alone. They wanted the spotlight. Fine, they could stand in it as long as they wanted. Soon enough, it would be shining on something they never expected: the consequences of underestimating the person who built their empire for them. What Mason and Leo never bothered to understand was that Skybridge didn't own the most critical piece of their shiny new operation. They assumed everything inside that warehouse belonged to them simply because it sat under their roof. But the heart of the system, the core hardware module that synchronized every scanner, every conveyor, every truck movement down to the second, was mine. Not leased through Skybridge, not co-developed, not shared, mine. Built under my company, Reyes Flow Dynamics, contracted separately at the very beginning when they claimed procurement delays would kill momentum. They pushed me to handle it myself, called it a favor to the company. They didn't read the fine print. Or maybe they just didn't think someone like me would ever need to use it. While they were busy polishing presentations and slapping their names onto diagrams, I was building something far more important than a warehouse system. I was building protection. Not sabotage, not revenge, just protection. Protection I learned to create after a previous employer pushed me out of a project I had given 2 years of my life to. This time, I wasn't going to be caught empty-handed. My module, tucked neatly behind panel B17 on the upper mezzanine, looked like just another nondescript piece of hardware. A slim steel casing, 2 cables, a status light. Nothing about it screamed importance. But inside were the timing regulators, synchronization protocols, and the sequencing engine. The pieces that made the entire warehouse behave like one coordinated organism instead of a chaotic sprawl. And embedded deep within the hardware was a licensing verification system I designed for long-term stability. Every 90 days, the module reached out to my company's secure server to verify its active license status. If all terms were met, the system continued operating at peak efficiency. If not, well, the system didn't crash. It didn't break. It simply slowed, bit by bit. Fractional delays in routing, slight hesitation in conveyor allocation, small reductions in optimal sequencing. The kind of decline no one notices at first. The kind that could be mistaken for heat, dust, or the simple aging of equipment. But give it a few days, and Skybridge's miracle warehouse would move like it had weights tied around its ankles. That feature wasn't designed for revenge. It was designed because I'd seen too many companies cut corners, ignore contracts, and then blame the vendor. This time, accountability wouldn't land on me. I kept quiet about the module throughout development, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because Mason never once asked a real technical question. He wanted outcomes, not understanding. So when the email firing me arrived, I didn't panic. I sat down at my desk that night and pulled up the licensing logs. The next verification date was approaching in just a few weeks, right before Skybridge's biggest investor audit of the year. A $60 million expansion opportunity depended on that audit. If the system performed as flawlessly as it had been, Skybridge would secure new routes, new capital, and a regional monopoly. But if performance dropped, Investors wouldn't just walk away, they'd run. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. I didn't need to touch anything. Nothing needed to be changed, modified, triggered, or tampered with. The verification system would do exactly what it was designed to do. Check whether Skybridge's licensing was fully up to date. And since Mason and Leo had ignored every invoice my company sent, deliberately, according to the billing trail, that verification was going to fail. Not because I pushed a button, not because I flipped a switch, but because they broke the agreement. They skipped payments, assuming I wouldn't have the power to enforce anything once they fired me. They thought I was powerless, disposable, replaceable. What they didn't realize was that removing me from the building didn't remove me from the system. I had built Skybridge, their miracle, but they had built my leverage, and soon they were going to feel exactly what that meant. Not out of spite, but out of pure, simple cause and effect. The first sign of trouble hit at 5:12 a.m. on a Tuesday, 24 days after they fired me. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but I knew the rhythm of that warehouse so intimately that I could picture the exact moment everything began slipping out of sync. The pre-dawn shift would have been rolling pallets onto lane 3, expecting the conveyor to pull each load into the distribution spine automatically. Instead, the timing engine hesitated. Half a second at first, then a full second. Just a small lag, barely noticeable. But in operations, seconds stack like bricks, and enough of them can crush an entire morning. By 6 a.m., scanners were queuing. By 7:15, workers were being rerouted manually. And by 8 tau, trucks scheduled for tight regional windows were still sitting outside in the rising desert heat. At 8:23 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number, Phoenix area code. I didn't answer. A minute later, it rang again and again. On the fourth call, I picked up. Catalina, thank God. It was Mason. His voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. Always so composed, so arrogant, so certain of himself. Not today. Today he sounded like a man watching the floor crumble under his own feet. We're experiencing severe performance issues, he said, trying to sound controlled but failing. The core module, your unit, it's not responding the way it should. Should, I repeated, letting the word linger. Is the license active? The silence told me everything. He hadn't even known they were supposed to pay. Or maybe he knew and assumed he could ignore it. Either way, the result was the same. We can fix the payments, he stammered. But investors arrive in 48 hours. This audit could secure a major expansion for us. We need you to come in and assess the system. I don't work for Skybridge anymore, I said. You made that very clear. He exhaled shakily. Catalina, please. This is serious. We'll compensate you. Now he was speaking my language, but not well. I don't return without a signed consulting contract, I said. My rate is $400 an hour, minimum 6 hours paid up front. He didn't argue. That was the first sign he was truly desperate. I arrived at the warehouse just after noon, walking through the doors with the same badge they hadn't bothered to deactivate. The floor was a mess. Workers scrambling, supervisors barking out manual instructions, scanners blinking warnings I'd coded myself. It would have been sad if it weren't so predictable. The air buzzed with tension. People who usually moved with confidence now hesitated before every decision. When they saw me, relief washed over their faces, but the executives, they looked like ghosts. Thank you for coming, Leo said stiffly, as if gratitude physically pained him. I didn't respond. I simply walked to the mezzanine, plugged into the diagnostic port, and pretended to analyze for 15 minutes. I didn't need that long. The logs told me everything instantly. License verification failed. Degradation protocol activated. System compensating but slowing progressively. Exactly as designed. Can you fix it? Mason asked, hovering behind me. His voice was trembling. The audit is in 2 days. If this continues, it will continue, I said calmly, closing my laptop. Unless the licensing issue is resolved. What do you need from us? Leo asked. I almost smiled. My original contract wasn't honored. said, "Invoices weren't paid, so a new agreement is required." What kind of agreement? They were so nervous I could smell it on them. 12,800 a month, I said. Licensing only, plus a 2-year commitment. If you agree, the system will restore itself within an hour. Mason looked like he'd been punched. Leo looked like he might faint. "This is extortion," Mason whispered. "No," I said softly, gathering my bag. "This is business, something you should have respected before you threw me away." And with that, I walked out, leaving them standing in the middle of their failing miracle, finally understanding that the person they dismissed was the only one who could save them. The agreement landed in my inbox at 7:42 the next morning, signed, sealed, and sent with a level of politeness that would have made me laugh if the stakes weren't so high. They didn't negotiate, didn't push back, didn't try to bluff their way through it. They couldn't. Not with investors arriving in just a few hours. As soon as the payment cleared, I accessed the module from my home office and restored the license verification pathway. The system's heartbeat steadied immediately. By noon, conveyors were flowing like water again, scanners were syncing to the millisecond, and trucks were rolling out in perfect sequence. Skybridge looked like the miracle operation Mason always pretended it was. That afternoon, during the investor walkthrough, they acted like they were witnessing magic. Clean lines, smooth timing, flawless coordination, the kind of performance that convinces people to sign contracts with more zeros than cents. And Mason, of course, stood there beaming, doing his best to pretend he'd orchestrated all of it. But something had shifted. The investors asked sharper questions, digging deeper than the surface-level charm he relied on. Twice, he had to call me for clarification. Me, the woman they fired. After the audit ended, he pulled me aside with a tight smile and asked if I'd ever consider coming back to Skybridge, maybe even leading their new technology division. I didn't bother hiding my amusement. "I already lead something," I said. "It's just not yours." 6 months later, my company, Reyes Flow Dynamics, was supplying systems to 3 of Skybridge's competitors, each one eager to avoid the mistakes Skybridge made. I didn't destroy them. I simply outgrew them. And as I stood in my new office overlooking a warehouse I actually owned, I realized something undeniable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't burning the bridge. It's watching the people who tried to bury you pay to cross yours. When I look back on everything that happened, the real lesson isn't about hardware, contracts, or logistics. It's about recognizing your own worth long before someone else tries to define it for you. For years, I believed that if I just worked harder, stayed longer, sacrificed more, people would naturally appreciate what I brought to the table. But life, especially corporate life, doesn't work that way. Some people only see value when it benefits them, and the second it stops, they'll throw you aside without hesitation. The lesson I carry now is simple. Protect yourself early, not after the damage is done. In my story, I didn't sabotage anyone, I didn't lash out, and I didn't burn their warehouse to the ground. I simply let the truth catch up to the people who tried to erase me. My leverage wasn't revenge, it was preparation, built long before the betrayal came. And that's something I think many Americans understand deeply. You can be loyal, hardworking, and honest, but you still need to guard the parts of you that can't be replaced. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, letting go of the bitterness so it doesn't eat you alive. But sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. Walking away without arguing, without begging, without screaming. That silence forces people to confront the consequences of their own actions. It's not vindictive, it's clarity. And in a world where so many workplaces overlook integrity and effort, choosing to value yourself can be the most powerful act of all. If there's something to take into your own life, it's this. Document your work, build your skills, protect your rights, and trust your instincts when someone shows you who they are. You can't control their behavior, but you can control your boundaries, your preparation, and your exit when the time comes. How to get started today. Write down 3 things you bring to your workplace that no one sees. Review any agreements, roles, or responsibilities you've taken for granted. Start one small project or habit that strengthens your independence, professional or personal. Set one boundary you've been afraid to set. If this story resonated with you, comment below with your thoughts, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.